thing right now?
Well, thanks for having me. First thing to say, when you look at the stadium, almost right after the Rams decided that they were going to leave and go to LA, regardless of the stadium that was on offer for them, you had the other plans sort of come out of the woodwork. Some of the things that maybe the convention center wanted to do, or people at the Scottrade Center, the Blues wanted to do, but probably weren't willing to say because of the dollar signs involved. And, the fact that people were so focused on the Rams. But once that was done, you saw multi-$100 million projects start to pop out from the other venues, the existing venues in St. Louis. One of those is, of course, the convention center, and there's no firm number on that because they're not quite sure what they want to do. And there's talks of even going as far as demolishing the dome formerly known as Edward Jones.
Right.
And, of course, the Scottrade Center, which the Blues obviously had a very good season, they're looking to have $160 million. That's a little bit more of a firm plan, and that's everything from upgrading the scoreboard to maybe having their own little Blues Park Village outside. And the real question is, how are these going to be paid for? Because obviously the tax levels that are in Missouri right now are in St. Louis to pay for these goods. They're not really sort of supposed to go any further than they are right now. And you also have the issue of, especially with the Scottrade Center, the Blues technically could go and try to cover all that cost, because right now we're just talking about public bonds. But who's repaying those bonds is actually who's going to be paying for it. So it could be the Blues decide we're going to pay back all of the bonds that the city's issuing for the stadium improvements, in which case that would be the team paying for those. Or they could try to seek public funding, as happened when the Scottrade Center was built initially as the Kiel Center.
In terms of the Scottrade Center, some of the work, as I understand it, has already started. They started as soon as the season was over in terms of some of the physical upgrades that are taking place, sort of the logistical things, some of the air conditioning and working on the ice and the scoreboards and that sort of thing. That stuff's going on right now. Generally speaking, we're talking about something that it's different than the Rams Stadium, where we're talking about building something new. This is an existing asset for the city. Does it make more financial sense for taxpayers to pay some of that cost?
The Scottrade Center, when it initially opened, was paid about 10% public financing, or not, 100% public financing, but 10% public funding, because
Right.
basically what happened was the city owns the lot. But it was developed by, at the time, the Kiel Center Partnership, which is sort of like an offshoot from Civic Progress. Now the Rams owners, I guess he keeps saying the Rams, the Blues ownership owns that lease. So they've got the building. They enjoy all of the benefits of that building. I don't know that it would make any more sense. From a public perspective, these improvements are for the benefit of the Rams franchise. I mean, especially when you look at some of the things that are on offer, like the outdoor year-round beer garden, which looks to me like they have an eye on competing with Ballpark Village, not necessarily keeping the stadium up to some level. I mean, the Kiel Center / Scottrade Center has only been open now for 22 years. It's not a very old stadium. And it's not as though there haven't been upgrades made along the way. This $160 million upgrade is actually more than the initial cost estimate of the entire stadium, and it's not going to be something just improving the air conditioning system. These are going to be big rebuilding projects that's going to take at least public financing, the tax-exempt bonds that the city will issue through the LCRA. And the question is, are they going to ask for the city to actually provide funding for that through tax revenue, which I hope they don't, but they might.
When the Blues have a good season, does that change the mathematical equation in terms of the public being more supportive to spend some taxpayer dollars on public sports stadiums or refurbishing or that sort of thing?
I do think that people generally are more supportive of spending money on sports stadiums when they see their teams winning, and that's natural. I think people see that, they enjoy it, they want it to keep going, they're more willing to support the team owners vis-a-vis perhaps maybe more frugal city managers or maybe residents who say they don't want to pay for such a thing. I don't think it changes the math in the long run in terms of, is the stadium, are sports teams suddenly more beneficial to a region than they are initially? I don't think that it could be argued that just because you had one season where you went to, well, they've had many seasons, but just because you did well in a particular season, that suddenly this entertainment venue is so much more valuable than the many different types of entertainment options available to St. Louis residents.
Bottom line, at some point, with both Scottrade and with the convention center, and these sorts of debates happen in cities all over the country, the public officials who are working with private industry to redevelop, in this case we're talking about redevelopment of existing public assets, are likely going to ask the taxpayers to help in some capacity. Is there a trend nationally as to how much of a percentage the public is willing to pay in terms of those sorts of things, from 100% down to 0%?
I wish I could say there was a trend moving towards private companies paying more of the share, but I think actually when you look around the country, you see huge variability. So if you go to a place like California, most cities in California, for whatever reason, whatever political reason, have been very reticent to publicly fund just about any type of sports stadium. So you see their percentages, maybe they only help on the financing, but zero funding, or maybe they don't do even any of that. I mean, you've seen the same kind of attitude taken in some East Coast cities like New York City especially. But, then if you go around the country, you will see sports stadiums still today funded 100% public funding on public land, so it can avoid tax, just like you see in some of the instances in St. Louis, especially with the Edward Jones Dome. And I think that the understanding that building a sports stadium is not an economic panacea has filtered down to some places, but in other areas, I think you do get people basically saying that, there's a large section of the voting population that would like to see sports no matter what the cost, and sometimes that pushes, I think, local politicians and basically city governments into paying what is necessary to keeping their teams.
Joe Miller, policy analyst with the Show Me Institute. Thanks for joining us, Joe. Appreciate your time. When we come back, John Inazu, I'm gonna try to say I think, did I say that right, John? John Inazu, associate professor at Washington University, to talk about his book, Confident Pluralism: Surviving and Thriving Through Deep Difference. You're listening to Tony Messenger on the Big 550 KTRS.